So, welcome to being at home with George during COVID. I'm excited to be here. And as we move into the holiday season, I think it's really important that the lessons that we have been learning over these past 8 or 9 months are really going to be necessary to get through this holiday season, which happens to be happening at the same time that we're getting a rise in cases and deaths and hospitalizations and also going back to a time where we had to stay at home or shelter in place. And so, as you might recall, I love to talk about this idea, this possibility of being able to embrace the hurt, the pain, the frustration, the fatigue, the COVID fatigue, and at the same time, generating hope, just finding a silver lining in the cloud, trying to find meaning in suffering so it ceases to be suffering or alleviates the suffering to some degree. And it's interesting because I've been working with my clients, and I was working with one organization, and it's a athletic department, and they just got word that not only did they have to cancel the fall season, but they were looking towards the spring, and now in the spring season has been canceled. And so having to working with coaches, having to go to the student athletes and talk to them about the fact that there's not going to be a season, and how do you manage that with especially when you have upper class folks or seniors that may not play at all during their senior year, and they're not even at school, they're at home. So it's really challenging. And so one of the things we discussed was this idea of making the shift from doing to being, because a lot of the conversations have to do with, well, how do we do this, or what are we going to do? We can't see them physically. We're not even going to have a season. What do we do? And so our discussion came back around to the idea that we had to make the shift from doing to being, and the idea of being, like being present, working on, and working on our personal skills, working on ourselves, working on the folks that we lead or we engage with, in a way where we're increasing or trying. How do you stay or have a connection when you're doing it through Zoom or through phone calls and that sort of thing? And so talk about values, and you talk about getting to know folks. So one of the things I talked about, because we talked about embracing the hurt, the pain, and generating the hope, and part of that is, so what can we do now that we normally don't have time to do? And that usually has to do with some introspection, looking at ourselves, thinking about what we want to do or who we want to be. And so when I like to talk about this idea of shifting from doing to being, so that when we get back to where we're able to engage in the activities we're not able to engage in now, we can hit the ground with both feet running and the heart humming. And so that means that in order to do that, that there's some things that I could attend to, that we can attend to. And a lot of that is on the relational realm, on how do we use our time, how do we develop our mind, how do we develop our emotional and social and learning skills in a way where we have a better relationship with ourselves as well as the folks we interact with, especially given the fact that we're probably staying at home with our family, and that can be a little testy because we have the cabin fever and we're just kind of locked in together. So we have to figure out how to make peace with that. And so to me, I always talk about, so what can we do now that we wouldn't be able to do ordinarily? And then once we've kind of exhausted that, then what's the next thing to do? So I'm very aware of the fact that not only are we back to where we were before in terms of staying at home, sheltering in place or whatever we want to call it, but now it's the holiday. With the holidays, and some of us we just experienced the Thanksgiving holiday, and a lot of us didn't travel, some did. And so now here we go, we're going through Christmas and New Year's coming up, and how are we going to deal with that? And so we're encouraged not to visit each other, or not to bring too many to bring folks into our home. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with this struggle? Because it is a loss. But the thing that is really important is, especially when we think about how helpless we feel, and how out of control things feel, because we're not able to do what we normally do. And when we value the holidays, whether it's we're celebrating Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever it is, it's just an opportunity for us to engage. And even at my house, we normally have the family over New Year's Eve to connect, and that's not going to happen. And so we have to really think about finding ways of being of service. And so to me, is what I learned a long time ago, is now is what's really important. We're struggling, we feel helpless. So how do I generate hope when I embrace the helplessness? So can I make the shift? And this is interesting because I just talked about making the shift from doing to being, but in being present, being honest with how I'm feeling, and being willing to ask myself, how can I make the shift from feeling helpless to being helpful, being hopeful? How do I do that? How do I find ways of being of service? And to me, it always comes down to this idea of just focusing on being is going to help us to be doing things that we need to do. Like, how do we deal with these feelings of helplessness, feeling out of control? And how do we find ways to be helpful, to be hopeful, generating hope? And this is more than just generating it intellectually or mentally, but actually doing hopeful things. So reaching out to others and thinking about actually reflecting, being grateful for what we have. So even though we're not doing what we were doing, at least we have a roof over our head. Hopefully we have food. Hopefully we have our health, and hopefully, most of the people around us, like myself, they're not sick or have died. Although some of us will be experiencing with that. They have family members that have passed away. But then we could think about, from my training, I know when I was getting into recovery, the best thing to do is to forget myself in service, and to look to help someone else. And that is maybe just reaching out to somebody, giving them a call, just checking on them and telling them how much we love them. Of course, now we have Christmas cards. You can send Christmas cards if you can afford to do that. Some people may not be fortunate enough to do that. But for me, I'm grateful for my health, for having a roof over my head, and being able to have a phone, or to be able to text people, or be able to get on Zoom or FaceTime with people. I'm reminded a couple months back, we had a storm and we lost power for 18 hours. And so here it is, winter, really cold. At least I have the lights are on, I have power. So being grateful for what I have, and realizing that the challenge now is, how do we get through these challenging times in a way where we just notice that we have to just make it through this time, so that we have to postpone our regular, in my case, the regular New Year's Eve Christmas party. We have to postpone it for a year. But in order for that to happen, we have to take care of ourselves, and we have to continue to do the things that's going to be helpful, like, like staying at home, and minimizing our interaction with others, even some family members, but also the idea of wearing a mask and social distancing and washing our hands. But at the same time, it doesn't mean we can't reach out to each other, reach out to people, pray for people, and to recognize that as bad as I feel, or as much as I may be suffering a little bit, there's somebody else suffering a lot more. Can't imagine what it would be like to be under this duress and being in a shelter, or not having a place, or not having enough food, or being in one of those long lines I've seen on TV in Texas and other places, where you're going to a food pantry and you're in a long line. You could be in line for hours, and hopefully there'll be food at the end of that. and just knowing that most people like to be self-reliant, that must feel very uncomfortable taking handouts or going someplace. And I was just listening to one woman who used to work for, well, she worked for a food pantry. So she went from giving it out to actually having to get food from the food pantry. So these are really challenging times, and they call forth the best of us when we can stay connected to our heart and realize that we are all connected. And so if one person is suffering or one person is under duress, we're all under duress, and we have to figure out how to make the shift from doing to being, and then sometimes even in this case, self-regulation and reaching out to others. How can we do in a way where our being is showing up and the doing in a way, maybe not hitting the ground with both feet running and heart humming, but we could be engaged in the doing with an open heart and an open mind, and with compassion and with love.